During boarding, the flight attendant leaned in and whispered to me, "Pretend you are feeling sick and leave the plane." I thought it was a bizarre joke. But then she came back, her eyes wide with terror, and said, "Please, I beg you, if you do not get off this flight, you are never coming back." My name is Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old. For 4 decades, I have built a commercial real estate empire in Seattle from absolutely nothing. I spent the earliest days of my life pouring concrete in the freezing rain, reviewing endless blueprints under flickering garage lights, and fighting fiercely in corporate boardrooms to ensure my future family would never know the bitter taste of poverty. I negotiated with ruthless contractors, dealt with utterly corrupt city officials, and meticulously built skyscrapers that now proudly define the Seattle skyline. I have always prided myself on being a man who could spot a liar from a mile away. If you think giving everything to your bloodline guarantees a peaceful retirement, take a deep breath. What I am about to share with you will shatter that illusion completely. If you have ever been betrayed by the people you sacrificed your life for, hit the like button and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is. It helps me know I am not speaking into the void. It all began on a Tuesday afternoon, on what was supposed to be a grand celebration of my life's work and my legacy. I was sitting in first class on a direct flight from Seattle to Zurich, Switzerland. The trip was an extravagant 70th birthday present, meticulously organized down to the finest detail by my second wife, Victoria, who is 42, and my 40-year-old son, Derek. We had been married for 5 years. Derek was my only biological son from my first marriage to a wonderful woman who passed away far too young. I gave him absolutely everything I had to offer. I paid for the finest private schools, completely paved his way to a top executive position in my firm, and blindly trusted him to uphold our name. To the outside world, we were the perfect picture of American success. The wealthy patriarch, the attentive younger wife, and the ambitious son, ready to take over the family business. As I settled into my plush pod, I should have been looking forward to the Swiss Alps. Instead, I was struggling to keep my eyes open. A thick fog had settled over my brain. It started earlier that morning in our kitchen overlooking Puget Sound. Victoria had handed me my usual coffee along with a small blue pill. She smiled her perfect smile and told me it was prescription motion sickness medication. She knew I hated turbulence, so I swallowed it without a second thought. I trusted her. But as the massive plane engines began to hum and the boarding process dragged on endlessly, my limbs felt incredibly heavy, almost as if they were slowly being filled with wet, sinking cement. My mind, usually sharp enough to catch a mathematical error in a 500-page report, was moving at a glacial pace. The blue pill. I had never needed motion sickness pills in my entire life, but Victoria had been incredibly persistent lately, hovering over me, managing my schedule. I mistook her control for affection. As the chemicals seeped deeper into my bloodstream, the symptoms became undeniable. My tongue felt thick. A cold sweat broke out. It was not drowsiness. It was chemical suppression. Someone was pulling the plug on my nervous system. I blinked hard, trying to clear the cobwebs from my vision, when a flight attendant approached my row. Her name tag read Sarah. She had a kind face, but she looked terribly tense. Her hands were trembling slightly. She leaned over my pod, pretending to check the latch on my tray table, moving with a stiff, rehearsed motion. As she reached across me, her hand brushed mine. I felt the dry texture of a folded paper napkin being pressed firmly into my palm. Her grip tightened, forcing my fingers to close around it. I looked up at her, completely confused. Before I could ask what she was doing, she leaned down, her lips barely an inch from my ear. "Pretend you are feeling sick and leave the plane," she whispered. She immediately stood up, plastered a bright professional smile on her face, and walked away down the aisle. I sat there in my seat, staring at the crumpled white napkin in my heavy hand. My heavily drug-addled brain desperately tried to process exactly what had just happened in front of me. Pretend I am sick. Leave the plane. I figured it was some kind of strange prank. Or maybe the medication Victoria gave me was causing hallucinations. I slowly rubbed my heavy burning eyes and managed to look directly across the wide carpeted aisle. Victoria and Derek were seated in the pods opposite mine. They were completely engrossed in their phones, their thumbs typing furiously. I noticed a thin sheen of sweat on Derek's forehead, which was strange because the cabin air conditioning was blasting at full force. His jaw was clenched tight. Beside him, Victoria was equally absorbed, biting her lower lip, a nervous habit I had rarely seen. We were embarking on a milestone birthday trip. They should have been celebrating. Instead, they looked like two conspirators waiting for a bomb to detonate. Then I noticed my custom black leather briefcase. It contained the physical encrypted hard drive with the master access keys to my company's global assets. Derek had insisted on carrying it. But instead of stowing it in the overhead bin, he had it strapped securely across his lap, his arms wrapped tightly around it. He was guarding it with his life. I wanted to call out to them to ask about the bizarre flight attendant, but my tongue felt swollen. My throat was incredibly dry. I lacked the physical energy to raise my voice over the ambient cabin noise. I desperately tried to unbuckle the heavy metal seatbelt and simply walk over to them, but my weakening muscles completely refused to obey my mind. I was a literal prisoner in my own luxurious seat. The engine noise shifted, a powerful rumble vibrating through the floorboards. We were getting closer to pushback. The doors would soon be sealed. I rested my head back, telling myself I just needed to sleep. I closed my eyes and listened to the sounds around me. The clicking of overhead bins being shut. The rustle of expensive luggage. It was the beautiful soundtrack of absolute privilege and exclusive world I had fought with everything inside me to provide for them. They loved me. They were taking care of me. That is what my heart wanted to believe. But my gut, the primal instinct that had kept me alive in the cutthroat real estate industry for 40 years, was screaming a very different story. I could instantly feel the cold, hard, terrifying truth settling deep into my aging bones. Suddenly, I felt a shadow fall over my face. I forced my heavy eyes open. Sarah, the flight attendant, was back. This time, she was not pretending to check a tray table. She knelt right beside my seat, ignoring protocol. The professional smile was gone. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with genuine terror that cut straight through the chemical fog in my brain. She gripped my forearm, checking to make sure Victoria and Derek were distracted. When she looked back at me, her voice was shaking so badly I could barely hear the words. "Please, I beg you," she whispered, her eyes pleading with mine, tears welling up. "If you do not get off this plane, you are never coming back." My heart stopped. The world around me went completely silent. The trap was already perfectly set around me, and the heavy steel jaws were closing right in front of my very eyes, leaving no escape at all. I watched Sarah walk briskly away, her crisp uniform disappearing behind the privacy curtain of the first-class galley. My heart, which had been so sluggish just moments before, began to hammer violently against my ribs. A sudden rush of pure adrenaline sliced straight through the thick chemical fog that was clouding my brain. I am a structural engineer by trade. For 40 years, I have made my living by looking at a massive building and knowing exactly where the weak points are simply by observing the tiny stress fractures in the concrete. Right now, the stress fractures were appearing everywhere, right inside my own family. I forced myself to sit completely still and breathe slowly. I had to evaluate my environment. I had to look at my wife and my son not with the blind affection of an aging patriarch, but with the cold, calculating precision of a man inspecting a compromised foundation. The physical sensation of the drug Victoria had given me was becoming increasingly difficult to fight. My arms and legs felt as though they were wrapped in heavy lead weights. Every time I tried to flex my fingers, the movement required an immense amount of concentrated mental effort. This was absolutely not a normal reaction to a standard over-the-counter motion sickness remedy. This was a potent, targeted neurological suppressant designed to render an adult male completely docile and physically helpless. I slowly turned my heavy head, deliberately keeping my eyes half closed so I would appear to be dozing under the heavy influence of the pill. Directly across the wide carpeted aisle, Derek and Victoria were sitting together in the middle section of the luxury seating pods. They were completely ignoring me. Instead, they were intensely focused on their mobile phones. Their thumbs moved in rapid, frantic bursts across the glowing screens. I watched my son Derek closely. The heavy air conditioning in the premium cabin was blasting cold air from the overhead vents. Yet my son was sweating profusely. A thick sheen of moisture coated his pale forehead, and his jaw was locked so tightly I could clearly see the muscles twitching beneath his skin. This was absolutely not the relaxed demeanor of a man heading on a luxurious vacation to celebrate his father's 70th birthday. He looked like a desperate man standing on the extreme edge of a steep cliff, preparing to jump into the dark abyss below. Beside him, my beautiful wife Victoria was equally tense. She kept biting her lower lip, a nervous habit I had rarely seen, and she was constantly refreshing the screen of her phone as if waiting for a highly critical confirmation. Then my eyes drifted down to Derek's lap, and a massive shockwave of cold realization hit my nervous system. He was holding my custom black leather briefcase. It was not resting comfortably on the floor between his feet. It was not safely stowed in the overhead luggage bin, where carry-on items belonged during the standard takeoff procedures. He had his arms wrapped securely around it, clutching the expensive leather tightly to his chest with pure white knuckles. Inside that specific briefcase was a physical, highly encrypted hard drive. It contained the master access keys, the digital security signatures, and the vital routing protocols for my entire commercial real estate empire. It held the literal keys to 40 years of my blood, sweat, and tears. Every property deed, every offshore holding account, and every corporate bank reserve I had tirelessly built in Seattle and beyond were accessible through that single drive. When we left the house this morning, Derek had practically ripped the briefcase from my hands. He had insisted it was far too heavy for me to carry, promising he would stow it safely for the long international flight. Why was he holding it like a lifeline now? Why was he guarding it with such intense, terrifying desperation? The scattered pieces of the puzzle were violently slamming into place inside my mind. I looked at the specific spatial layout of our expensive seats. I always requested an aisle seat for long international flights, so I could get up, walk around, and stretch my aging legs without disturbing anyone. It was a well-known preference of mine that I had strictly maintained for over 3 decades of corporate travel. But early this morning, Victoria had handed me a boarding pass for a window pod. She had smiled so sweetly, claiming she wanted me to have a beautiful view of the Swiss Alps when we finally landed in Zurich. She told me it would be much quieter and more peaceful for my rest. Now, looking at the configuration with my fully awakened senses, I realized the terrifying, calculated truth behind her actions. I was seated deeply by the window. Victoria was assigned the seat directly next to me, effectively blocking my only clear exit to the main aisle. The bulky privacy partitions and the sliding doors of the first-class suite meant I could not simply step over her without causing a massive scene. I was completely boxed in. If I wanted to leave this airplane, I would have to physically climb over my own wife while battling the heavy sedative coursing through my veins. The chilling reality of my situation washed over me like a bucket of freezing water. I was completely isolated, intentionally drugged, and physically trapped inside a luxurious high-altitude cage. They had meticulously planned every single detail of this departure. The seating arrangement was deliberately designed to contain me and restrict my movements. The heavy medication was administered to neutralize any physical resistance I might offer once the flight was underway. The briefcase was secured in my son's grip to ensure my life's work was entirely in his possession before the plane even left the tarmac. My own flesh and blood, the son I had raised and mentored, was conspiring with the woman who shared my bed. They were operating in perfect, seamless tandem to orchestrate my absolute downfall. The intense focus on their phones was likely communication with their accomplices or monitoring the progress of whatever sinister transaction they had set into motion back in Seattle. I could feel the powerful sedative fighting fiercely against my sudden surge of adrenaline. It was pulling heavily at my eyelids, urging me to simply surrender to the darkness, let go of my suspicions, and fall into a deep sleep. But I knew, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that if I allowed myself to close my eyes, if I allowed this massive commercial airliner to take off and ascend into the clouds above the Pacific Ocean, my life as an independent man would be permanently over. I had to fight the overwhelming lethargy that was threatening to consume my entire body. I had to focus on the deep, burning anger that was beginning to ignite within my chest. Every blueprint I had ever drawn, every skyscraper I had ever constructed, taught me that even the most elaborate structure has a critical point of failure. I just desperately needed to clearly find theirs right now, before the heavy metal cabin doors sealed tightly shut forever. I forced myself to take a steadying breath, drawing dry cabin air deep into my lungs. The panic seizing my chest needed to be locked away. I am a man who has negotiated multi-million-dollar deals with my back pressed firmly against the wall. I realized that if I panicked or shouted, I would look exactly like a delusional old man having a mental breakdown. They would simply call a doctor, claim I was having an episode, and use it as further proof for institutionalization. I had to remain calm and gather information. I had to force them to look me in the eye and lie directly to my face. I summoned every single ounce of physical strength I had left, fighting the dense sludge of heavy medication coursing through my veins. It took a monumental effort just to clear my throat. My mouth felt completely stuffed with dry cotton. I slowly shifted my weight in the luxurious leather seat, ensuring the movement appeared incredibly lethargic, like a medicated old man settling in for a long flight. I turned my head toward the center aisle, fixing my heavy gaze on my wife and my son. They were staring intensely at their mobile phones, their thumbs moving with frantic precision. I let out a low, raspy cough to announce my attention. Victoria looked up first. Before her highly practiced facade slipped back into place, I saw a distinct flash of pure alarm in her wide eyes. She clearly had not expected the heavy sedative to allow me to remain this lucid. Derek noticed her sudden reaction and immediately looked up. His broad shoulders tensed, and his grip on my black leather briefcase tightened even further, his knuckles turning a stark bone white under the bright cabin lighting. I managed a weak, confused smile. I kept my voice intentionally low and slightly slurred, playing the part of the drowsy patriarch they desperately needed. "Victoria, my dear," I mumbled, forcing the words through heavy lips. "Why am I sitting all the way over here in the window pod? You know perfectly well that I always request the aisle seat. I have sat on the aisle for every single flight I have taken over the last 30 years. It makes me feel far too confined to be boxed in against the bulkhead." Victoria immediately stood up and leaned across the privacy partition separating our luxury pods. The calculating conspirator vanished instantly, replaced flawlessly by the comforting image of a deeply devoted wife. She reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of gray hair away from my forehead. Her face was a perfect mask of tender matronly concern. "Oh, darling," she murmured, her voice dripping with thick artificial sweetness. "I am so incredibly sorry if you feel trapped in there. But this was actually a medical decision. I spoke with your doctor just last week, and he strongly recommended that we change your seating assignment for this specific trip." "My doctor," I repeated, letting genuine confusion color my tone. I had not seen a doctor for anything other than routine blood work in 2 entire years. What on earth was she talking about? "Yes, sweetie," she continued, leaning closer, her expensive perfume masking the foul scent of absolute deception. "He said your heart has not been in the best condition lately. He was very concerned about the physical stress of such a grueling journey across the Atlantic Ocean. He specifically advised me to put you in the window pod to keep you completely separated from the constant foot traffic in the main aisle. You will not be randomly bumped by the heavy service carts, and you will not have flight attendants constantly walking past your shoulders. It is the absolute quietest, most peaceful spot in the entire first-class cabin. He just wanted to make sure you could sleep peacefully without any stressful interruptions. We are only trying to protect your heart, my love." The lie was delivered with such flawless, terrifying precision that if I had not just been warned by a terrified flight attendant, I might have actually believed every single word she said. She spoke with the practiced, effortless ease of a woman who had rehearsed this exact script 1,000 times before a mirror. I slowly shifted my gaze away from her beautiful, deceitful face and looked directly at my son. Derek was still clutching the vital briefcase to his chest. I let my eyes fall down to his lap, ensuring he knew exactly what I was looking at. "And you, Derek," I said, allowing a slight edge of fatherly authority to seep back into my sluggish voice. "Why are you guarding my work briefcase like it is a national security threat? We are about to take off. The flight crew is going to tell you to put that heavy thing up in the overhead storage bin. There is absolutely no reason for you to be holding onto it like that." Derek swallowed hard. I saw his Adam's apple bob nervously in his thick throat. But just like Victoria, he quickly recovered his composure with terrifying speed. He shifted his body weight, trying to appear completely relaxed, and flashed me the charismatic, confident smile that had won him countless corporate contracts. "It is just really heavy, Dad," he replied smoothly, his voice projecting a perfect blend of casual respect and practical concern. "You have half the home office packed into this thing." I was just thinking about the heavy turbulence we might hit over the ocean. I did not want to risk putting it up in the overhead bin. What if the safety latch fails and this massive leather block comes crashing down on someone's head? Or worse, what if it falls and hits you while you are sleeping? I am just keeping it safe down here with me. I will tuck it securely under the seat once we are safely airborne. There is absolutely nothing for you to worry about. He leaned forward slightly, resting his right hand on top of the leather case, patting it reassuringly. "Relax, Dad. You have worked incredibly hard for so many decades. You have earned this long break. Just close your tired eyes and let the medication do its job. Zurich is going to be absolutely amazing. We have an incredible itinerary planned for your birthday. Just let us take care of everything for once." They were incredibly good. They had constructed a perfectly logical narrative and delivered it without a single stutter. To anyone watching, they were just an attentive family, taking excellent care of their aging father. I nodded slowly, playing the role of the pacified old man who had accepted their loving explanations. "You are right," I whispered, letting my tired eyes flutter shut. Victoria smiled warmly. "That is a wonderful idea, darling," she said softly. She reached out to lovingly squeeze my hand resting on the armrest. But the moment her skin made contact with mine, a violently cold shock traveled up my arm. Her fingers were freezing cold, and her rapid pulse was racing frantically against my wrist. I knew instantly that behind those perfect, reassuring smiles, they were both absolutely terrified to their very core now. I let my heavy head loll sideways against the headrest, allowing my eyes to drift shut, as if the medication had finally claimed my consciousness. I slowed my breathing, matching the steady cadence of an aging man falling into a deep sleep. To Victoria and Derek, I was exactly where they needed me to be. A compliant, sedated, ignorant old fool. But beneath the facade of my closed eyelids, my mind was working with a furious, desperate clarity. I am a structural engineer by trade. My entire life has been dedicated to finding the hidden flaws in massive constructions. I know that when a towering steel beam is placed under immense pressure, it does not simply snap without warning. It groans under the strain. It physically shifts. It reveals tiny hairline fractures along the surface long before the catastrophic collapse happens. Victoria had just handed me a massive structural flaw on a silver platter. The doctor. She had looked me directly in my eyes, stroked my cheek with feigned affection, and boldly claimed my cardiologist had specifically ordered this window seat to protect my failing heart. It was a beautiful, comforting lie designed to pacify me, but it was a complete fabrication. I have not seen a cardiologist in over 2 years. My last medical evaluation was clear. There was no doctor. There was no consultation. Victoria wove a seamless story out of thin air, delivering it with a practiced, terrifying sincerity. I felt a cold knot form deep in the pit of my stomach. If my wife could lie to my face so effortlessly about something so fundamental, what else was she lying about? I tried to shift my stiff legs beneath the heavy airline blanket, but they felt like they were encased in solid blocks of wet concrete. The physical sensation creeping through my body was becoming profoundly alarming. The slight mental fog I had felt in the airport terminal had rapidly evolved into a thick, suffocating blanket of severe neurological suppression. My resting heart rate, which should have been elevated by the adrenaline of my terrifying realization, was instead dropping to a slow, unnatural, and sluggish rhythm. My chest felt incredibly tight and constrained. Every single shallow breath required a deliberate command from my fading brain. I focused all my remaining mental willpower on keeping my trembling hands relaxed on my lap, ensuring my fingers did not twitch or clench. I had to maintain the illusion of compliance. If they realized I was aware of my surroundings, if they sensed even a tiny fraction of the panic tearing through my analytical mind, they would quickly adapt their sinister plan. I was sitting mere inches away from the two people I thought I loved most in the world, yet I had never felt so entirely isolated and profoundly in danger. The luxurious first-class cabin had transformed into a high-altitude prison cell. I listened to the muffled sounds of the boarding process continuing just behind us, the clinking of seatbelts being fastened, the murmurs of flight attendants, the distant roar of the jet engines slowly spooling up for our departure. It was the terrifying soundtrack of my impending doom. Beside me, Victoria shifted her weight in her wide seat. The soft rustling of her expensive designer silk blouse was incredibly loud in the quiet confinement of our premium pod. I kept my eyes firmly closed, but allowed a very small, completely natural slit to remain slightly open beneath my thick eyelashes. It was a narrow, secret window into the dark world I was now desperately trying to understand and survive. She reached her hand down into the spacious leather tote bag resting neatly near her feet on the cabin floor. As she leaned her upper body over the smooth privacy partition between our adjoining seats, illuminated with a sudden bright, piercing glow. Her mobile phone resting face up on the wide center armrest had just received an incoming notification. The glass screen flared to brilliant life, casting a harsh pale blue light across the darkened space of my seating area. I instantly knew I only had a few precious seconds before the digital screen automatically timed out and faded back into blackness. I aggressively forced my heavy drugged eyes to focus sharply on the illuminated glass surface. The incoming text message was displayed clearly in bold, dark letters directly on the lock screen. It was from Derek. My own biological son sitting just across the narrow carpeted aisle, tightly clutching my entire life's work to his chest. The terrifying words burned themselves directly into my aging retinas with absolute clarity. Did he swallow the whole pill? The Alpine facility is waiting for the transfer confirmation. My desperate breath caught sharply in the back of my dry throat. I had to forcefully bite the soft inside of my right cheek to actively stop myself from physically reacting to the shock. The sharp, metallic taste of warm blood quickly filled my mouth. The glowing phone screen suddenly went black, plunging my narrow view back into the shadows of the cabin. Victoria calmly sat back up in her seat, completely unaware that I had just secretly read the digital blueprint of my own personal destruction. I closed my eyes tightly, the cruel words repeating endlessly in my racing mind, like a terrifying, unbreakable mantra. Did he swallow the whole pill? The Alpine facility. Transfer confirmation. The final devastating pieces of this horrific puzzle violently slammed together with a sickening, brutal force that rocked me to my core. The blue tablet Victoria had lovingly handed me in our kitchen was definitely not a mild motion sickness remedy. It was a potent, highly targeted neurological drug, specifically designed to chemically incapacitate me to render me entirely helpless and unable to physically resist. And the final destination, the Alpine facility. They were absolutely not taking me to a luxury vacation resort in the snowy Swiss mountains to celebrate my 70th birthday. They were deliberately transporting me to a secure, highly isolated psychiatric institution, I realized with a massive, crushing wave of absolute dread what a transfer confirmation meant in this terrifying, calculated context. They desperately needed me fully compliant, heavily sedated, and completely unable to fight back or answer basic questions when we finally landed on foreign soil. They were actively planning to permanently commit me to lock me away in a distant country where I had absolutely no legal recourse, no personal contacts, and no voice whatsoever. And the heavy black briefcase clutched so desperately in Derek's sweating hands held the master encryption keys to my entire financial empire. The exact moment the foreign facility officially confirmed my institutionalization, Derek would immediately execute the massive wire transfer. They were going to brutally drain 40 years of my blood, sweat, and tears in a matter of digital seconds, leaving me to silently rot in an isolated, drug-induced haze. My old blood ran completely cold in my veins. The deep, inescapable lethargy pulling firmly at my tired, aging bones was no longer just a mere chemical symptom of a toxic pill. It was the physical manifestation of my own family burying me alive. The sensation of my family burying me alive was no longer a metaphor. It was a chemical reality invading every cell in my body. I felt the moment the heavy sedative breached my blood-brain barrier. My heart, which had been pounding with the frantic adrenaline of a cornered animal, began to slow down to an unnatural rhythm. Each beat felt like a massive effort, a hollow thud echoing inside my chest cavity. I tried to command my lungs to draw in a deep breath of filtered cabin air, but my chest felt wrapped in bands of unyielding steel. The weight pressing down on my sternum was immense. I have spent 40 years calculating the load, bearing capacities of massive concrete pillars and towering steel girders. I know precisely what it looks like when a critical support structure begins to buckle under an impossible weight. Right now, my own nervous system was that failing structure. The blue pill Victoria had lovingly pressed into my hand was executing a perfectly calculated demolition of my motor skills. My vision began to narrow, the bright edges of the first-class cabin blurring into soft watercolor smears. The ambient lighting overhead seemed to dim, casting long shadows across the pristine, cream-colored leather of my seating pod. I focused every ounce of my remaining willpower on keeping my right index finger still. If I gave them even the slightest indication that I was fighting the drug rather than succumbing to it, I knew they would adapt their plan. They might call for a doctor on board to administer an emergency injection, claiming I was having a severe psychiatric episode. I had to remain entirely motionless, trapped inside the failing fortress of my own body. The potency of the chemical coursing through my veins was staggering. This was not a standard remedy designed to ease travel anxiety. This was a heavy medical-grade neurological suppressant. It was the kind of chemical restraint they use in high-security psychiatric wards to neutralize combative patients. The absolute coldness of their calculation was breathtaking. Victoria had smiled at me across our kitchen island. She had kissed my cheek. She had poured my coffee. And she had seamlessly handed me the chemical weapon they needed to strip away my autonomy, my fortune, and my freedom. I allowed my head to tilt slightly toward the window, keeping my eyelids lowered to a microscopic slit. Through the blurry haze of my fading vision, I maintained a direct line of sight to the middle section of the cabin. Victoria and Derek were sitting side by side, bathed in the soft blue glow of their phone screens. The frantic energy that had surrounded them just moments before was beginning to dissipate. They were settling into a sickeningly comfortable rhythm of shared complicity. I watched closely as Victoria slowly locked her device and slipped it back into her expensive designer tote bag. She turned her head slightly to her left, looking directly at my son. Derek looked back at her. In the quiet environment of the premium cabin, words were no longer necessary between them. I witnessed the silent exchange of their mutual triumph. Victoria offered him a slow, deliberate nod. It was a subtle downward tilt of her chin, accompanied by a cold relaxation of her facial muscles. Derek received the silent message and responded with a brief smile of pure victory. The tension in his shoulders evaporated instantly. He finally loosened his white-knuckled grip on my black leather briefcase, allowing the asset to rest slightly lower on his lap. The visual confirmation of their successful transfer was complete. The isolated Alpine asylum in the remote Swiss mountains was waiting for my arrival. The offshore bank accounts were primed and ready to swallow the $20 million they were stealing from my legacy. They believed the dangerous first phase of their elaborate trap was now perfectly executed. I was safely secured in my window pod, thoroughly drugged and isolated from the main aisle. They had won. Or so they thought. After sharing that sickening look of triumph with my wife, Derek slowly turned his head to look directly across the aisle at me. He believed with absolute certainty that I was deeply unconscious, lost in a chemically induced slumber from which I would not wake until we were thousands of miles away from American soil. Because he thought he was entirely unobserved, he allowed his carefully constructed facade of the devoted son to completely fall away. The mask shattered, revealing the true face of the man hiding beneath it. What I saw in my son's eyes in that brief moment was the most devastating blow of my entire 70 years of existence. It was not just greed. It was not just a cold ambition to forcefully seize control of my commercial real estate empire. It was pure, unadulterated contempt. Derek looked at me as if I were a piece of rotting garbage that had been left out in the sun for far too long. He looked at the father who had paid for his elite education, who had handed him an executive position, and who had trusted him unconditionally with absolute burning disgust. His upper lip curled into a slight mocking sneer. His eyes, so painfully similar to my own, were filled with a dark, resentful hatred that took my breath away. He did not see a father. He did not see a mentor. He saw a pathetic, foolish obstacle that he had finally managed to neutralize. He saw a clueless old man who had practically handed over the keys to his own destruction. The psychological agony of witnessing that sheer contempt radiating from my own flesh and blood hurt infinitely more than the chemical poison shutting down my nervous system. It was a deep, twisting knife in my heart. Everything I had built, every sacrifice I had made over 4 decades of grueling labor had ultimately created this monster sitting just across the aisle. I forced my shallow breathing to remain steady, suppressing the powerful urge to launch myself out of the pod and wrap my weakening hands around his throat. I needed to channel that immense pain into pure, calculated survival. The drug was actively trying to pull me down into a dark void, but the burning anger radiating through my chest provided a desperate lifeline of mental clarity. I slowly mapped out the physical dimensions of my immediate environment. My legs were wedged between the side of the aircraft fuselage and the bulky base of the tray table. Victoria's sleek leather seat was fully reclined right next to mine, forming an impenetrable physical barrier between my pod and the only exit path to the main aisle. Even if I could summon the immense physical strength required to stand up, I would have to practically crawl directly over her lap to escape. She would scream. She would claim I was having a violent psychological episode. Derek would immediately jump up to restrain me. The flight crew would have no choice but to intervene and secure me to the seat for the safety of the other passengers. A direct physical confrontation was absolute suicide. I needed a strategy that leveraged their own false sense of security against them. I urgently needed to use the very condition they had forced upon me as my ultimate weapon. Suddenly, the soft ambient background music playing throughout the luxurious cabin faded into total silence. The sudden quiet was replaced by the sharp double chime of the aircraft intercom system. The sound pierced through the heavy chemical fog, clouding my brain like a loud, blaring alarm bell. The captain's deep, professional voice echoed through the hidden overhead speakers, carrying a message of absolute finality. "Ladies and gentlemen, boarding is now complete. Flight attendants, please prepare the main cabin doors for departure and cross-check." The announcement sent a massive jolt of pure adrenaline straight into my sluggish, failing heart. The boarding process was completely finished. The endless stream of passengers shuffling down the aisles had stopped. The ground crew was actively pulling the heavy jet bridge away from the side of the massive airplane. I had less than 3 minutes before the thick, reinforced steel doors of the main cabin were permanently sealed shut and locked from the inside. 3 minutes before, this luxurious metal tube was forcefully pushed back from the gate, severed from the terminal, and taxied toward the active runway. 3 minutes before, I was completely trapped in the sky for 12 grueling hours, completely at the mercy of two people who were actively orchestrating my permanent demise. The lethal trap they meticulously built around my entire existence was swinging shut with a terrifying finality that echoed deeply within my own racing mind. The time for silent observation had officially run out. I had to summon every remaining ounce of strength and make my move right now, or I was never coming back. My heart stopped. The world around me went completely silent. The trap was already perfectly set around me, and the heavy steel jaws were closing right in front of my very eyes, leaving no escape at all. The heavy thump of this closing overhead bins echoed like gunshots in my ears. I lay trapped against the curved wall of the airplane, my body pinned down by the invisible chains of the chemical sedative. But my mind was suddenly running at a staggering pace, fueled by a primal instinct to survive. The sudden clarity was sharp and painful, illuminating the dark corners of the past 3 months like a harsh spotlight. Every strange occurrence, every dismissed anomaly, every odd conversation suddenly aligned into a singular, terrifying narrative. I had been incredibly foolish to mistake their calculated maneuvers for genuine familial affection. The first piece of the horrific puzzle snapped into place with a sickening thud inside my mind. Just 4 weeks ago, Derek had practically barged into my corner office at the commercial real estate firm. He had carried a thick stack of urgent legal documents, his face flushed with manufactured excitement. He claimed he found a once-in-a-lifetime commercial real estate acquisition in downtown Seattle. It was a massive hotel property in foreclosure, and he insisted we needed to act within hours. But there was a catch. He desperately needed me to sign a comprehensive temporary power of attorney. He looked me directly in the eyes and sworn it was only a standard administrative protocol to execute the initial transfer of funds while I played golf that weekend. I was a man who usually scrutinized every single contract line by line. But looking at my biological son, seeing the eager ambition in his eyes, I had felt a profound sense of paternal pride. I wanted to empower him. I wanted to show him that I completely trusted his business acumen. So I took my heavy gold fountain pen and signed away my financial autonomy on the dotted line without demanding a secondary review from my legal team. That temporary document was the literal skeleton key to my entire life savings. He had not needed it to buy a luxury hotel. He needed it to meticulously drain every single liquid asset I had spent 40 years building. I distinctly remember the heavy mahogany desk in my office the day I signed that paper. I had smiled proudly, thinking I was handing my son the ultimate torch of leadership. I handed him the blade to cut my own throat instead. Then came the second devastating memory, crashing over me like a freezing ocean wave. It was Victoria. 2 months prior, she had abruptly fired Maria, our loyal housekeeper of 15 years. Victoria claimed she caught Maria stealing expensive silver flatware. When I demanded evidence, Victoria wept, playing the victim perfectly. She insisted she did not want to involve the police. I let Maria go with a generous severance. Before leaving, Maria tried to warn me privately in the garden. She was crying, swearing she never stole a dime, warning me that Victoria was changing things, and the house felt wrong. I had ignored her tearful warnings, completely blinded by a younger woman's calculated affection. With Maria permanently out of the house, Victoria completely took over the massive kitchen. She abruptly fired our weekly catering service and insisted on preparing all my meals herself, claiming she wanted to ensure my diet was perfectly optimized for my advancing age. And then came the vitamins. She bought a massive, elaborate pill organizer and began administering my daily supplements with unwavering, cheerful dedication. She watched me swallow them every single morning, handing me a glass of fresh water and waiting patiently until my throat cleared. I thought I was the luckiest man in the world to have a younger wife who cared so deeply about my health and longevity. I now realized with absolute horror that she had systematically eliminated the only neutral witness in our home. Maria was fired simply because she was far too observant. With the house completely empty of outside eyes, Victoria had total unchecked access to my food and my medication. The blue pill on the airplane was not a sudden, desperate gamble. It was the grand finale of a slow, methodical chemical conditioning process that had likely been happening right under my nose for weeks. She was quietly building a false medical history, preparing my body for the ultimate betrayal. The third memory finalized the terrifying picture, sealing my complete understanding of their horrific trap. Just 10 days ago, we had hosted a lavish dinner party at our waterfront estate. I had excused myself from the loud dining room to grab a fresh bottle of vintage wine from the cellar. As I walked down the quiet, carpeted hallway, I bumped into Megan, Derek's wife. She was completely intoxicated, holding a half-empty glass of expensive champagne and leaning heavily against the wall. Megan was always a clueless woman, entirely focused on high society gossip and expensive designer bags. She slurred her words, complaining loudly about how boring my son had become lately. She told me Derek was spending every single night locked inside his home office, aggressively studying international banking regulations. She specifically mentioned his sudden obsessive fascination with Swiss corporate laws and private asset protection in Zurich. She laughed, foolishly assuming he was planning to buy a luxury ski chalet. I had chuckled along, assuming my ambitious son was simply researching complex tax havens to protect our domestic corporate profits. During that same dinner party where Megan stumbled into me, I recall seeing Derek standing by the roaring fireplace, entirely detached from the joyful celebrations. He was staring at me with a hollow, emotionless void in his eyes. The warning signs had been everywhere, loudly screaming for my immediate attention. How could I have been so remarkably blind? The Swiss banking laws, the absolute privacy of foreign accounts, the Alpine facility. Derek was not researching tax havens for the company. He was actively studying the strict legal loopholes required to forcefully commit an American citizen to a foreign psychiatric institution, and exactly how to wire $20 million out of the country without triggering immediate federal fraud alerts. Megan was nothing but a convenient, oblivious prop in his grand performance, completely unaware that her own husband was actively plotting to destroy his father and disappear forever with his stepmother. I focused my heavy, burning eyes back on the present moment. The luxurious cabin around me was a blur of rapid movement and sound. The flight attendants were marching quickly down the aisles, methodically securing the heavy overhead compartments. They were performing their final safety checks with practiced rhythmic efficiency. The massive jet engines beneath my feet hummed with a deep, vibrating power that rattled the floorboards. We were rapidly approaching the point of no return. I slowly shifted my gaze toward the front of the aircraft cabin, looking past the privacy barrier of my leather seating pod. I looked straight toward the main galley area where the flight crew was finalizing preparations for departure. There she was, Sarah. She was standing perfectly still near the heavy metal frame of the main cabin door. The senior flight attendant was standing right beside her, gripping the large red mechanical handle, waiting for the final clear signal from the captain to seal the aircraft. Sarah was looking directly down the long aisle. She was looking straight at my seat. The professional, courteous demeanor required for her demanding job was completely gone. Her face was pale, drawn, and filled with a desperate, frantic anxiety. As our eyes finally met through the narrow gap in the cabin with seating, the ambient noise of the airplane seemed to completely fade away. She did not say a word, but her expression screamed louder than any emergency alarm siren. She gave me one last agonizing look of pure, unadulterated pleading. Her wide eyes clearly communicated the horrific reality of my situation. It was a silent, desperate message passing between two complete strangers. She was begging me to find the internal strength to save my own life before it was too late. The senior attendant began to pull the massive steel handle downward. The thick rubber seals of the heavy door began to hiss loudly, physically locking out the safe, familiar air of the Seattle airport terminal. The physical gateway to my survival was literally closing right in front of my face. If that door clicked into its final locked position, I would be entirely at the mercy of the deadly chemicals pumping through my blood and the two monsters sitting just across the aisle. I had absolutely no more time to plan, no more time to gather my scattered thoughts, and no more time to mourn the devastating loss of my family. I had to break this chemical paralysis now. It was absolutely now or never. I had to break this chemical paralysis now. It was absolutely now or never. If I simply stood up and started screaming about being violently kidnapped by my family, I would just quickly validate Victoria's entirely manufactured medical history. A raving, drugged elderly man shouting conspiracy theories on an international flight would be instantly restrained with zip ties by the flight crew. They would apologize to my embarrassed wife, and the plane would take off as scheduled. I had to bypass their narrative entirely. I had to create a scenario so undeniably urgent, so physically catastrophic, that federal aviation regulations would demand an immediate medical evacuation before the wheels ever left the tarmac. Victoria had cleverly built her flawless lie around my allegedly failing heart. It was a tragic narrative designed to explain my upcoming demise. Now I was going to use that exact same narrative to completely destroy her plan. If she wanted a cardiac emergency, I was going to give her the performance of a lifetime. I drew in a shallow breath, focusing all my fading energy on my left arm. The neurological sedative had turned my muscles to heavy lead, but I did not need precise coordination for what I was about to do. I needed raw, chaotic momentum. I violently threw my stiff upper body forward, intentionally missing the padded armrest and slamming my shoulder directly into the heavy plastic casing of the tray table. The table unlatched with a sharp crack, dropping heavily onto my knees. I did not stop there. I let out a sudden loud guttural gasp, a terrible sound, violently torn from the very bottom of my dry throat. It was not entirely fake. The sheer effort of moving against the heavy drugs was genuinely agonizing. I raised both of my trembling hands and clutched tightly at the fabric of my tailored shirt right over the center of my chest. I deliberately twisted my face into a mask of pure agony, tightly squeezing my eyes shut and baring my teeth as if a hot knife had been driven straight through my sternum. Victoria screamed. It was a piercing sound of genuine shock, completely breaking her constructed facade of control. She had expected me to quietly fade into a chemical sleep, not erupt into violent physical distress. I completely ignored her frantic reaction entirely. I let out another loud, choking gasp, dragging air into my lungs as if I were drowning. I thrashed my heavy legs outward repeatedly and forcefully, kicking the hard privacy partition separating our premium seats. I needed to get out of the pod and into the main aisle where everyone could see me, where I could not be contained or managed. I grabbed the edge of the seat and violently hauled my heavy body sideways. I allowed my full weight to fall over the side of the armchair. I crashed heavily onto the floor of the main cabin, my legs hopelessly tangled in the thick airline blanket, my hands still clawing desperately at my chest. I rolled onto my back, staring up at the overhead lights, my chest heaving erratically. The entire front section of the massive aircraft instantly erupted into absolute chaos. Other passengers gasped and stood up from their seats, peering over the partitions to see what was happening. The refined atmosphere of the premium cabin was shattered. I ruthlessly continued my performance, letting my eyes roll back slightly, emitting short, ragged wheezes that sounded exactly like a dying man taking his final breaths. I could feel the cold sweat beading on my forehead, a genuine physiological reaction to the immense stress and the heavy medication fighting inside my system. It added a layer of authenticity to my desperate act. Within mere seconds, the sound of footsteps pounded down the aisle directly toward me. It was Sarah. The senior flight attendant had not hesitated for a fraction of a second. She dropped to her knees beside my head, her face pale but intensely focused. She was not acting like a woman dealing with a routine passenger complaint. She was moving with the urgent energy of a professional responding to a medical emergency. "Sir, Mr. Harrison, can you hear me?" she shouted clearly, her voice cutting through the rising panic in the cabin. She did not wait for my response. She reached over her shoulder and pulled a bright green portable oxygen cylinder from a hidden compartment near the galley bulkhead. She uncoiled the plastic tubing and prepared the mask. "Stay with me, sir. We are getting you oxygen right now." She commanded, her hands moving with practiced speed. I kept my eyes half open, maintaining my performance, but I shifted my focus slightly to watch my family. Victoria was standing frozen right over me, her shaking hands hovering in the cold air. She was frozen in a state of terror. Her meticulously crafted plan was rapidly disintegrating on the floor right in front of her wide eyes. But it was Derek who truly revealed the depths of their depravity. He did not look at me with the horrified concern of a son watching his father suffer a massive heart attack. He looked at me with the panicked desperation of a criminal watching his million-dollar heist collapse at the last second. He carelessly threw his heavy briefcase onto his leather seat and aggressively lunged across the aisle. Derek forcefully pushed his way past his paralyzed stepmother and stood directly over my body. His handsome face was flushed dark red with extreme, barely contained anger. He did not kneel down to comfort me. He did not ask Sarah how he could help save his father. Instead, he reached down and grabbed Sarah by her shoulder, attempting to pull her away from my gasping body. "Stop! Get away from him now!" Derek shouted, his voice cracking with a terrifying edge that shocked the passengers. "You truly do not understand what is happening here. He does not need oxygen. He is perfectly fine." Sarah jerked her shoulder out of his grip, her eyes blazing with professional outrage. "Excuse me, sir. This man is having a medical emergency. Step back immediately so I can administer this oxygen." She shot back, her tone commanding and unyielding. But Derek was losing his mind. He could hear the heavy cabin doors securing shut in the background. He knew that if a medical emergency was officially declared, now the captain would abort the departure sequence. The plane would return to the gate the paramedics would board, and I would be taken to a hospital where his foreign power of attorney would be useless. He stepped forward again, blocking Sarah from placing the mask over my face. "I said, leave him alone," Derek hissed, leaning down so his sweating face was mere inches from the flight attendant. "He is just having a panic attack. He gets them all the time before flying. It is a documented psychiatric condition. Do not call this in. Tell the captain to proceed with the takeoff sequence right now. We have his calming medication right here in my bag. We handle this privately. Just shut the cabin doors and take off." Sarah did not flinch at all. She stood her ground against my son with the fierce determination of a true professional. She informed Derek that federal aviation regulations strictly mandated immediate medical intervention for any passenger exhibiting physical signs of cardiac distress. She stated clearly she was not authorized to accept a family diagnosis over the strict safety protocols of the international airline. Derek stepped forward again, his face a contorted mask of furious panic, insisting he possessed my prescribed calming medication and that the flight must depart on schedule. But the commotion had already drawn the attention of the cockpit. The sharp crackle of the overhead speaker abruptly interrupted his desperate demands. The captain announced that due to a severe medical emergency in the premium cabin, the aircraft would not be pushing back from the gate. He instructed the ground crew to immediately reconnect the jet bridge and requested paramedics to board without delay. Victoria let out a very sharp gasp, collapsing back into her wide leather seat, her hands trembling violently. She knew exactly what this meant. Their perfectly timed international extraction was falling apart before her eyes. Within less than 2 minutes, the heavy steel door of the aircraft swung open again. 3 paramedics in uniforms rushed down the aisle carrying a collapsible stretcher and heavy bags of life-saving equipment. 2 uniformed airport police officers followed closely behind them, securing the immediate area to ensure the medical team had adequate space to work. I maintained my agonizing performance with ruthless commitment. I kept my breathing shallow and wet, allowing my eyelids to flutter erratically toward the ceiling. The lead paramedic dropped to his knees beside me, checking my pulse and shining a diagnostic light directly into my sluggish pupils. He loudly reported to his team that my heart rate was dropping dangerously low and my neurological responses were severely depressed. He assumed I was experiencing a massive cardiovascular event complicated by a major stroke. I felt strong hands carefully lifting my chemically sedated body off the cabin floor. They expertly transferred me onto the rigid surface of the stretcher, securing thick canvas safety straps tightly across my chest and thighs. The physical sensation of the powerful drug was still actively fighting against my natural willpower, making my limbs feel like solid blocks of lead, but the burning fire of my survival instinct kept my analytical mind razor-sharp. As the paramedics began to lift the stretcher, Derek finally lost his composure. The facade of the corporate air vanished, replaced by the frantic energy of a cornered thief. He lunged toward his seat, grabbing the briefcase that contained the master encryption keys to my entire real estate empire. He clutched the leather tightly against his chest, his knuckles turning bone white. He stepped directly into the aisle, blocking the paramedics from moving my secured stretcher toward the open cabin door. He demanded that they stop immediately, shouting that he was my legal next of kin and held absolute legal authority over my medical care. He insisted he was coming with me to the hospital and that his stepmother would remain on the flight to manage our affairs. He tried to push his way past the broad shoulders of the lead paramedic, his dark eyes locked onto the illuminated exit sign. He knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that if he could just get off this confined plane with that specific briefcase, he could still execute the massive wire transfers from the public airport terminal. He just needed a stable internet connection and the encrypted hard drive to completely erase me. I could not let him leave this aircraft. If Derek stepped off this plane with my keys, my life works would vanish into offshore accounts within an hour. I had to use the last weapon available to me. I had to play the role of the selfless patriarch one final time. I forced my left arm to reach out from beneath the canvas straps of the stretcher. My hand trembled violently as I grabbed the fabric of the nearest police officer trousers. I gripped the material with desperate strength. I let out a terrible rattling cough, forcing the concerned officer to lean closer to my sweating face. "My son," I wheezed, keeping my voice weak. "He cannot miss this flight. Please, officer, you must make him stay on the airplane." The officer looked down with deep sympathy, placing his hand over my trembling fingers. I forced hot tears to well up in my eyes, gazing up at the officer with the pleading of a dying father. "All of our company documents are locked in the checked luggage down in the cargo hold," I gasped, letting my words slur to mimic a stroke. "His presentation in Zurich is tomorrow morning. Our entire family business depends on it. He cannot lose those bags now. Please tell him I will be perfectly fine. Tell him I order him to stay on this plane and finish the job. Do not let my boy ruin his career because of my failing heart." The performance was flawless. The police officer stood up tall, his face hardening with resolve. He placed his frame directly between Derek and my stretcher. He raised his hands, pushing my furious son backward into the narrow space between the seating pods. "Sir, you need to step back and clear the aisle immediately," the officer commanded with authority. "Your father has specifically requested that you remain on this flight to manage your family affairs. We are currently dealing with a critical evacuation, and you are actively obstructing emergency personnel." Derek opened his mouth to argue, his face twisting with panicked rage, but the second police officer immediately stepped forward, resting his right hand casually on his heavy utility belt. The silent implication was perfectly clear. If Derek continued to interfere with an emergency, he would be arrested on the spot. The briefcase would be confiscated as property, and he would spend the night in a concrete holding cell instead of transferring my massive fortune. Derek slowly lowered his aggressive gaze, his chest heaving with defeated, bitter fury. He took a slow, agonizing step backward, retreating silently into the dark shadow of his seat. The paramedics seized the clear path. They wheeled my stretcher forward smoothly, navigating the tight corner of the galley and pushing me out through the open cabin door. The bright fluorescent lights of the airport jet bridge washed over my pale face, as the wheels of the stretcher rolled over the threshold, connecting the aircraft to the terminal. I tilted my head backward. Through the narrowing gap of the closing airplane door, I caught one final glimpse of my betrayers. Derek was standing completely frozen in the middle of the aisle, still clutching the utterly useless briefcase, his face pale with utter defeat. Victoria was weeping loudly into her manicured hands, the devastating reality of their ruined plan finally crushing her. The heavy steel door of the massive airplane violently slammed shut. The thick mechanical locking levers engaged with a loud thud that echoed down the long tunnel. The heavy rubber seals hissed loudly as the pressurized cabin locked them away. They were permanently sealed inside. They were completely trapped in a flying metal tube bound directly for Switzerland, facing a brutal 12-hour flight over the dark Atlantic Ocean, with absolutely no cellular service and no wireless internet connection. They were completely disconnected from the modern world, entirely unable to execute the wire transfers, and completely powerless to stop what I was about to do next. The paramedics pushed my stretcher rapidly up the gentle incline of the carpeted jet bridge. The cool air-conditioned breeze of the sprawling terminal rushed over my sweating skin. The double doors of the jet bridge opened automatically, revealing the busy, crowded expanse of the main airport concourse. The exact moment the heavy glass doors slid shut behind us, completely separating us from the massive aircraft and the boarding gate, the agonizing burning in my chest miraculously vanished. The wheezing stopped instantly. I took a deep, clear breath of regular air. The thick chemical fog of the heavy sedative was still weighing down my aging limbs, but my analytical mind was sharper than a surgical razor blade. I unclasped my trembling hands from my chest and laid them flat against my sides. I slowly, deliberately sat straight up on the rigid medical stretcher. The lead paramedic gasped loudly, nearly dropping his side of the heavy gurney in pure shock. The other medics froze instantly in their tracks, staring at me as if a corpse had just reanimated before them. The look of extreme cardiac agony had vanished from my face. I looked the stunned lead paramedic directly in his wide, terrified eyes, my voice perfectly steady, entirely cold, and carrying the undeniable commanding authority of a man who had just taken his life back. "I am not having a heart attack," I stated calmly. "I need a secure phone right now." The lead paramedic stared at me in stunned silence, his hands frozen on the metal rails of the stretcher. The stark fluorescent lights of the terminal reflected in his wide eyes. He had just sprinted off a departing international flight, with a man he believed was suffering a massive cardiovascular event, only to have that same man sit up and demand communication equipment. I did not have the luxury of giving him a gentle explanation. The heavy neurological sedative was still dragging my physical movements down into a thick swamp, but the searing fire of survival had completely taken over my nervous system. I swung my heavy legs off the side of the rigid medical gurney, planting my feet firmly on the carpeted floor of the concourse. A wave of dizziness washed over my vision, but I forced my spine to remain perfectly straight. I reached out and took the mobile phone directly from the trembling hand of the junior medic standing to my left. I told them to cancel the ambulance and cancel the emergency hospital transfer immediately. The lead paramedic began to loudly protest, citing strict medical liability protocols and the dangerous irregularity of my heart rate just moments prior. I stopped his protests by handing him my Platinum Premium travel card, instructing him to bill my private insurance for the full emergency response, and assuring him that a private medical team was already en route to meet me. I walked away from the stunned emergency crew, moving with a deliberate, measured pace to mask the immense physical effort required for every single step. I bypassed the main terminal exit and headed directly for the attached luxury airport hotel. My mind was rapidly sorting through decades of corporate crisis management protocols. I needed an impenetrable base of operations, isolated from the public eye, where I could systematically dismantle this treacherous family trap. I approached the private concierge desk and secured their largest executive suite, paying in cash from my travel wallet to avoid leaving an immediate digital footprint. Within 15 minutes, I was standing inside the expansive soundproofed room on the 12th floor. The heavy oak doors locked behind me, sealing out the chaotic noise of the busy airport. The opulent suite was going to serve as my personal war room. I sat down at the large glass dining table and dialed the first critical number. Victor Rossi is a private investigator who operates strictly in the shadows of the corporate world. He is a ruthless, highly efficient man who specializes in uncovering the deepest secrets of rival executives. I had retained his services exclusively for corporate espionage over the past 15 years. He answered on the second ring. I explained the situation with cold, clinical precision, omitting zero details about the chemical betrayal and the forged medical narrative. Victor did not waste a single second offering useless sympathy. He immediately dispatched his private medical technician to my hotel suite. The technician arrived in record time carrying a sleek black medical case. I rolled up the sleeve of my tailored shirt, and the technician quickly drew 2 full vials of my blood. This was the most crucial piece of physical evidence I needed. The blood test would officially document the exact chemical composition of the heavy neurological sedative Victoria had given me. It would permanently destroy her manufactured story about a weak heart and a panic attack, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that I had been intentionally and maliciously poisoned. As the technician packed away the vials and hurried out the door to secure the chain of custody, I dialed my second contact. Benjamin Carter has been my lead corporate attorney for 3 decades. He knows every single intimate detail of my financial holdings, every hidden offshore reserve, and every complex routing protocol securing my real estate empire. He answered his phone with a cheerful greeting, completely unaware that the foundation of our entire work was actively under siege. I ordered Benjamin to execute a total immediate lockdown of all corporate servers and personal bank accounts. I instructed him to freeze every single liquid asset, revoke all secondary access privileges, and immediately invalidate the temporary power of attorney I had foolishly signed for Derek just 4 weeks ago. Benjamin was shocked by the aggressive tone of my demands, but he recognized the absolute severity in my voice. He promised to personally oversee the network freeze and verify the account security with our primary banking directors. I ended the call and placed the phone flat on the cold glass table. The physical toll of the powerful drug was returning with a vengeance, pulling heavily at my eyelids and turning my muscles to stone. I forced myself to remain seated upright, gripping the edges of the table to ground my fading senses. The enormous digital clock on the hotel wall ticked forward in agonizing slow motion. Every passing minute felt like an entire lifetime. I stared at the blank television screen across the room, watching my pale reflection. The realization that I was racing against a completely invisible, highly automated digital timer was absolutely excruciating. I knew Derek was currently trapped in the sky, completely isolated from any digital communication, but I also knew his elaborate plan relied heavily on precise, automated timing. The sudden vibration of the phone against the glass shattered the heavy silence of the suite. It was Benjamin. I snatched the device and pressed it tightly against my ear, anticipating the comforting confirmation of a successful network lockdown. Instead, I heard the sound of my trusted lawyer struggling to catch his breath. His normally confident, booming voice was shaking with an uncontrolled, terrifying tremor. Harrison Benjamin whispered the raw panic in his tone, echoing through the speaker. The lockdown completely failed. The automated security protocols were overridden. Your master accounts were fully drained exactly 2 hours ago using the specific power of attorney you signed. $20 million in liquid assets is gone now. The words hung in the sterile air of the hotel suite, echoing with a chilling finality. $20 million. Liquidated, routed, and completely vanished into the digital ether. For a brief agonizing moment, the sheer magnitude of the theft threatened to crush the remaining breath right out of my burning lungs. That money was not just a number on a ledger. It was the absolute lifeblood of my entire commercial real estate empire. It represented 40 grueling years of missed holidays, sleepless nights, and relentless grinding labor. It was the financial safety net I had painstakingly woven to protect my family for generations, and my own son had just mercilessly severed it with a single forged signature. I closed my eyes tightly, feeling the cold glass of the table pressing hard against my damp palms. A lesser man might have simply collapsed under the suffocating weight of such an intimate betrayal. A lesser man might have surrendered to the heavy chemical sedatives still clawing desperately at his nervous system. But I am a structural engineer. When a massive building faces a catastrophic structural failure, you do not sit down and weep in the dust. You immediately brace the collapsing foundation, you rapidly calculate the remaining load-bearing capacity, and you aggressively go to work. I opened my eyes, the sorrow instantly vaporizing completely, replaced by a freezing, calculated rage. I instructed Benjamin to keep tracing the offshore routing numbers and abruptly terminated the call. I looked up just as Victor Rossi stepped back into the executive suite. The private investigator took one sharp look at my hardened expression and immediately knew the parameters of our engagement had drastically shifted. I told him the money was already gone. I told him my son had successfully executed the massive wire transfer while sitting directly across from me on the airplane. Victor did not offer a single word of useless sympathy. He simply nodded his dark eyes, analyzing the tactical situation. I stood up from the glass table, ignoring the heavy, lingering sway of the potent neurological drug. I told Victor we were leaving immediately. We were going directly to the corporate headquarters in downtown Seattle. The digital theft had been authorized using my temporary power of attorney, but the actual execution, the complex routing protocols, and the offshore account architectures had to have been meticulously built and stored somewhere secure. Derek was incredibly arrogant, but he was also highly organized. The digital blueprints of his massive financial heist were undoubtedly locked inside his executive office. We bypassed the hotel lobby, entirely utilizing the discreet service elevator to reach the underground parking garage. Victor drove his nondescript black sedan through the empty, rain-slicked streets of Seattle with aggressive precision. The towering skyline of the city loomed ahead, in the dark, a sprawling landscape of steel and glass that I had personally helped construct. I stared out the passenger window at the passing streetlights, my mind a churning vortex of cold calculations. Derek was currently trapped in the air, completely unreachable, in a luxurious first-class pod, completely unaware that his aging, clueless father was actively dismantling his perfect crime. We arrived at the imposing glass facade of my corporate headquarters just past 2 a.m. The massive lobby was completely deserted, bathed in the soft glow of the security desk monitors. The night guard immediately stood up, his eyes widening in shock as he recognized the founder of the company walking through the revolving doors in the dead of night. I offered him a tight, commanding nod, raising my hand to forestall any questions. I simply stated that we were handling an urgent international crisis and required immediate, unrestricted access to the executive floor. My master keycard chimed softly against the private elevator panel, granting us direct entry to the highest level of the skyscraper. The executive floor was eerily silent, the thick carpets muffling our rapid footsteps. We walked directly past my sprawling corner suite and stopped abruptly in front of Derek's office. The heavy mahogany door was shut tight. I reached out and pulled the polished brass handle. It was firmly locked. This was not a standard corporate security measure. Derek had specifically installed a heavy-duty biometric deadbolt cylinder on his private office door just 3 weeks ago, claiming he needed advanced protection for highly sensitive client acquisitions. Now I knew the absolute truth behind his sudden obsessions with maximum security. I turned and looked at Victor. The private investigator did not hesitate. He dropped his heavy black equipment bag onto the carpet and swiftly produced a high-powered specialized magnetic drill. He did not bother attempting to elegantly pick the advanced lock. We did not have the luxury of time. The heavy drill whined with a piercing, high-pitched scream as the hardened titanium bit effortlessly chewed through the expensive biometric cylinder. Sparks flew across the dark corridor as the internal locking mechanism violently shattered. Victor delivered a sharp, precise kick directly below the handle. The heavy mahogany door swung open with a loud crack, revealing the inner sanctum of my treacherous son. The spacious office smelled faintly of his expensive designer cologne and the bitter stench of absolute deceit. His massive custom-built walnut desk dominated the center of the room. It was meticulously clean, completely devoid of any physical paperwork or loose files. Derek never trusted physical copies. He kept his entire life hidden behind heavily encrypted digital firewalls. Victor moved efficiently, pulling a thick array of specialized cables and a heavy metallic laptop from his dark bag. He bypassed the standard docking station and directly hardwired his rigorous hacking equipment straight into the main processing unit of Derek's secure desktop workstation. I stood silently by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the dark sleeping city below my chest, tightening with a profound, agonizing sorrow. This room was supposed to be the staging ground for his brilliant future. I had designed this specific office for him as a gesture of immense pride. Now, it was nothing more than an active crime scene. The bright screens of the desktop flared to life, illuminating Victor's intense, focused face. His fingers flew across his keyboard in a rapid, continuous blur. He was aggressively running a brute-force decryption protocol, actively dismantling my son's expensive digital security barriers one by one. The progress bar on the hacking terminal crawled forward with agonizing slowness. I paced the length of the expensive Persian rug, the last lingering effects of the heavy sedative finally burning away entirely completely, replaced by the sheer adrenaline of the hunt. After 10 excruciating minutes, the screen flashed a brilliant solid green. Victor breached the primary firewall. He immediately launched a targeted search protocol, aggressively hunting for offshore routing numbers and the missing $20 million. Instead, his hand suddenly froze on the metallic computer mouse. He quickly opened a highly encrypted file completely unrelated to the stolen money. A single document slowly rendered on the large monitor. It was a forged medical dossier from a corrupt neurologist officially diagnosing me with severe, violent, and entirely irreversible forms of self-harming and terminal dementia. The words on the glowing screen blurred for a moment, as my brain stubbornly refused to process the staggering level of pure malevolence staring back at me. I leaned closer to the monitor, my hands gripping the edge of the heavy walnut desk so tightly that my knuckles ached. The medical report was meticulously detailed, bearing the official letterhead of a highly exclusive, notoriously discreet private clinic located just outside of Seattle. The physician of record had practically written a masterpiece of medical fiction. According to this legally binding document, my cognitive decline had been rapid, aggressive, and incredibly dangerous over the past 6 months. The corrupt doctor had carefully documented fabricated episodes of violent paranoia, severe memory loss, and a complete inability to manage my own personal affairs or basic physical needs. I read the wildly fabricated accounts of me endlessly wandering the dark streets at night, violently threatening the terrified household staff, and forgetting the names of my closest business associates. Victoria was listed as the primary desperate caregiver, bravely bearing the heavy burden of my tragic mental collapse. Derek was designated as the sole legal guardian, stepping up to save the family legacy from my supposed erratic destruction. They had crafted a flawless, legally watertight narrative that painted me as an immediate danger to myself and others. It was the absolute perfect justification for what they had planned next. Victor did not say a single word. He simply clicked the mouse, opening the next file in the encrypted directory. It was a glossy, high-resolution digital brochure for a place called the Alpine Serenity Center. The photographs showed a stunning palatial estate nestled deep within the snow-capped peaks of the Swiss Alps. It looked like a luxury retreat for the ultra-wealthy, complete with pristine mountain views, crackling stone fireplaces, and impeccably dressed staff. But as Victor scrolled past the marketing images and opened the attached legal contracts, the true horrifying nature of the facility was laid completely bare. It was not a luxury vacation resort. It was a maximum security, highly isolated psychiatric asylum designed specifically for wealthy families who needed to permanently disappear their problematic relatives. The contracts were a masterpiece of terrifying legal maneuvering. Derek and Victoria had already prepaid the exorbitant admission fees, securing a lifetime stay for me in their most restrictive, locked-down wing. I read through the rigid admission protocols with a growing sense of absolute dread. The facility required the immediate permanent surrender of all personal electronics, mobile phones, and internet communication devices upon arrival. My passport and all forms of official identification were to be firmly locked in their secure vault, completely inaccessible to the patient. The Swiss guardianship laws they were exploiting were incredibly strict and highly localized. Once I crossed the threshold of that remote mountain fortress under a heavy chemical sedative, I would be legally classified as a permanent ward of the institution. I would have absolutely no legal right to demand an outside attorney. I would have no right to contact the American embassy. I would not even have the right to request a secondary medical evaluation from an independent doctor. The facility was designed to be an absolute black hole. My name would simply be quietly erased from the public record, replaced by a patient identification number in a foreign database. I would spend the rest of my natural life staring at a beautiful snowy mountain through shatterproof reinforced glass, surrounded by locked doors and heavily medicated by orderlies who did not speak my language. It was a bloodless murder. They had found a way to completely extinguish my existence without ever leaving a single physical mark on my body. The sheer calculating brutality of the plan was almost impossible to fully comprehend. My own biological son, the boy I had raised with every possible advantage, the child I had protected and mentored for decades, had meticulously planned to bury me alive in a gilded cage. He had calculated the exact dosage of the chemical sedative required to keep me compliant during the long flight. He had arranged the luxurious first-class pods to hide my incapacitated state from the flight crew. He had even coordinated the exact timing of the massive financial wire transfers to coincide perfectly with the moment the asylum administrators confirmed my physical admission into their locked psychiatric ward. The digital paper trail Victor was uncovering showed that the $20 million they had stolen was just the initial down payment on their new life. Once I was legally declared incompetent in a foreign jurisdiction, Derek would use the precedent to seize absolute unquestioned control over the entire commercial real estate empire. He would liquidate every single domestic asset, sell off the historic properties I had spent my entire life acquiring, and funnel the massive proceeds directly into their hidden offshore trust accounts. Victoria would play the role of the tragically heartbroken devoted wife who was forced to make an incredibly difficult medical decision for her ailing husband. She would receive endless sympathy from our wealthy social circle back in Seattle. They would attend charity galas and society dinners weeping elegant practiced tears while secretly spending my fortune. I leaned heavily against the polished edge of the walnut desk, feeling a deep physical nausea churning violently in the pit of my stomach. The chilling reality of how incredibly close I had come to suffering that exact fate was overwhelming. If I had simply swallowed that blue pill with a glass of water, if I had trusted my loving wife for just one more day, if I had not noticed Derek aggressively guarding my heavy leather briefcase on the airplane, I would be currently chained to a medical bed, flying directly into a permanent waking nightmare. I would have woken up thousands of miles away from my home, completely stripped of my voice, my money, and my identity, screaming to deaf ears that I was perfectly sane. The sheer terror of that alternate reality sent a freezing shiver racing down the entire length of my spine. I took a deep, shaky breath, forcing myself to look away from the terrifying asylum contracts. I needed to maintain my composure. I had to focus on the immediate task at hand. The money was gone, but the digital evidence of their horrific crimes was perfectly preserved right here on this machine. Victor Rossi continued his aggressive search through the hard drive, his dark eyes scanning the complex directories with robotic efficiency. He was currently digging through the archived drafts of my son's encrypted email server, searching for any direct communication with the corrupt local neurologist or the foreign administrators of the Alpine facility. We needed hard, undeniable proof of their premeditated conspiracy to present to the federal authorities. Victor's fingers danced across the keyboard, rapidly opening and closing dozens of mundane corporate folders. Then he suddenly paused. His cursor hovered over a completely isolated, heavily hidden secondary folder buried deep within the system architecture. It was simply labeled with 2 letters, V and D. I stared at the small yellow icon on the large monitor. Victoria and Derek. It made perfect logical sense that they would have a shared encrypted digital space to coordinate their massive financial heist and my illegal medical extraction. I braced myself, fully expecting to see more offshore routing numbers, stolen real estate deeds, or perhaps detailed instructions on how to slowly liquidate my remaining domestic corporate assets. I nodded grimly at Victor while giving him the silent authorization to proceed. Victor executed a rapid brute force decryption algorithm, easily smashing through the weak password protection, protecting the hidden directory. The folder clicked open instantly, filling the wide computer screen with hundreds of high-resolution files. But there were absolutely no financial spreadsheets displayed on the monitor. There were no scanned legal documents, no bank transfer confirmations, and no medical records. The entire folder was filled exclusively with personal photographs and short, silent video clips. I stepped closer to the screen, my heart hammering violently against my ribs as my tired eyes attempted to process the shocking images flooding my vision. The very first photograph was taken inside the master bedroom of my own waterfront estate. It was a candid, intimate shot of 2 people tangled together on the expensive silk sheets of my own bed. I felt the remaining oxygen forcefully expelled from my lungs, as if I had just been brutally punched directly in the soft solar plexus. The extreme visceral shock of the sudden disgusting discovery hit my nervous system like a massive runaway freight train crashing heavily through a solid brick wall. I squeezed my eyes tightly shut, but the horrifying, twisted image was already permanently burned into my aging mind. My stomach violently heaved, a sudden powerful wave of raw physical sickness rushing rapidly up my burning throat as I stared at the glowing monitor in a state of absolute, complete, and paralyzing disbelief. The first image was not a drunken anomaly or a momentary lapse in judgment. As Victor rapidly scrolled through the hidden gallery, a sickening chronological timeline of pure deception unfolded right before my eyes. There were hundreds of photographs, each one a sharp blade driven deeper into my bleeding chest. They were captured in luxury hotel rooms across Europe, in the back seats of tinted corporate vehicles, and most devastatingly, within the supposedly sacred walls of my own home, my son and my wife. The sheer audacity of their documented intimacy was staggering. The digital timestamps on the files clearly indicated that this horrific affair had not started after Victoria and I were married. The dates went back exactly 4 years. It began long before I even knew she existed. The heavy nausea in my stomach twisted into a freezing, razor-sharp realization. Our initial meeting at that charity gala in downtown Seattle had not been a charming coincidence. I vividly remembered bumping into her near the Champagne Tower, captivated by her elegant laugh and her apparent interest in my philanthropic work. It was all a meticulously choreographed performance. Derek had scouted her, trained her, and intentionally positioned her directly in my path. He knew exactly what kind of woman I would find irresistible after years of corporate isolation. She was a targeted weapon deployed by my own flesh and blood to infiltrate my life, secure my legal binding affection, and systematically dismantle my defenses from the inside out. My marriage was nothing more than a deeply cynical 4-year-long financial transaction. Victor remained completely silent, his face a mask of professional stoicism, as he opened a subfolder containing thousands of exported text message logs. The raw, unfiltered transcripts of their private conversations painted a picture of absolute remorseless sociopathy. I leaned over his shoulder, reading the rapid-fire exchanges between the two monsters I had called my family. They mocked my predictable routines. They joked about my minor health complaints. They celebrated the day I legally updated my will to include Victoria as my primary beneficiary. The messages revealed a chilling level of coordination. Derek would deliberately create stressful situations at the firm to elevate my blood pressure, while Victoria would play the soothing, concerned wife at home, slowly building the false narrative of my failing health. The truth about Megan Derek's oblivious wife was equally devastating. The text threads dismissed her as a convenient temporary prop. Derek had married her solely to project the image of a stable, grounded corporate heir. He needed the board of directors to see a responsible family man ready to inherit the empire. Megan was completely blind to the fact that her husband was using her social status as a smokescreen while he actively planned to disappear forever with his stepmother. They discussed their future with sickening enthusiasm. They shared links to sprawling beachfront estates in remote non-extradition countries. They compared the banking privacy laws of various tropical tax havens. They were building a billionaire fantasy life entirely on the ashes of my engineered demise. The sheer scale of their horrific ambition was laid bare in a lengthy exchange dated just 2 weeks ago. Victoria had messaged Derek expressing a brief moment of anxiety about the upcoming flight to Zurich. She was worried about administering the heavy sedative in a public space. Derek's response was terrifyingly cold and calculated. He assured her that the chemical dosage was perfectly calibrated to induce a compliant semi-comatose state without triggering immediate cardiac arrest. He reiterated the timeline with military precision. They would drug me, fly me across the Atlantic, and hand me directly over to the waiting orderlies at the Alpine Asylum. The moment the facility processed my involuntary admission, the pre-authorized wire transfers would clear, funneling $20 million out of my domestic accounts and into their untraceable offshore trust. They had planned every single contingency except for one. They had fundamentally underestimated my will to survive. I stepped back from the glowing monitor, the crushing weight of the ultimate betrayal settling heavily onto my shoulders. The woman I had promised to love and protect, and the son I had spent my entire life building an empire for had conspired to erase my existence. They wanted to steal my fortune, strip me of my freedom, and leave me to rot in a foreign psychiatric prison while they lived in tropical luxury. The profound evil required to execute such a plan was almost incomprehensible, but understanding the depth of their depravity also crystallized my absolute resolve. I was no longer an aging patriarch trying to understand a family misunderstanding. I was a man fighting a war for my life. I turned away from the desk and paced the length of the dark office, my mind racing through the complex, tactical variables. The digital evidence Victor had just uncovered was incredibly damning, but it was essentially a motive without a completed crime. The photographs and text messages proved they were having a deeply unethical affair and planning a massive financial theft. However, because Benjamin had confirmed the $20 million wire transfer had already cleared the master accounts just 2 hours ago, they technically possessed the financial upper hand. The money was currently resting in a shadow account legally authorized by the very power of attorney document I had willingly signed with my own pen. From a strict, purely legal standpoint, proving that the wire transfer was a malicious theft and not a legitimate business transaction executed by an authorized proxy would require a lengthy, brutal courtroom battle, a battle that could take years to untangle through international banking courts. I did not have years. I needed to paralyze them right now today, before that plane touched down on Swiss soil. I needed absolute, undeniable proof of premeditated criminal intent. I needed a smoking gun that clearly demonstrated attempted murder, kidnapping, and extreme medical fraud. The forged medical dossier from the corrupt Seattle neurologist was a solid start, but it was just a piece of paper. I needed physical evidence of the act itself, and I needed an independent, highly credible witness who could officially testify to the exact events that had transpired on board that aircraft. The blood test results currently being processed by Victor's technician would definitively prove that a heavy unauthorized neurological sedative was in my system. But proving exactly who administered the drug and precisely how the entire medical emergency was handled required someone who was present during the chaos. Someone who saw the panic, who heard the lies, and who possessed the professional authority to document the timeline of the chemical attack. My thoughts immediately snapped back to the luxurious premium cabin of the massive commercial airliner. I visualized the frantic moments just before the paramedics had wheeled my stretcher off the plane. I remembered the intense, unwavering professionalism of the senior flight attendant. She had defied Derek's aggressive demands to ignore my distress. She had cited federal aviation regulations and firmly refused to accept his fabricated story about a simple panic attack. She had looked directly into my eyes during those desperate seconds before the cabin doors closed, recognizing the silent, desperate plea of a man trapped in a chemical prison. Her name was Sarah. She was the absolute key to completely destroying their false narrative. The flight crew was required by strict international aviation laws to maintain a highly detailed minute-by-minute incident log of any medical emergency that occurred during the boarding process. Sarah would have officially documented my severe physical symptoms, Derek's deeply suspicious and aggressive interference, and his explicit documented demands to depart the gate without seeking proper medical clearance for a dying passenger. Her official airline report, combined with my toxicological blood results, would elevate this situation from a complex civil financial dispute into a massive multi-agency federal criminal investigation. But there was a massive critical problem standing directly in my way. The aircraft was currently hurtling through the stratosphere at 600 miles per hour, completely isolated over the dark expanse of the northern Atlantic Ocean. Derek and Victoria were trapped inside that flying metal tube for the next 10 hours, completely unaware that their entire lives were systematically being dismantled on the ground. But Sarah was also on that exact same flight. I could not simply dial her mobile phone or send an email to her personal inbox. She was working a secure international route strictly governed by airline communication blackouts. I stood in the center of the silent office looking over at Victor, who was already meticulously cloning the highly encrypted drive onto his portable servers. We had to establish a direct line to that specific cockpit immediately. The $20 million was already gone, resting in their shadow accounts, giving them a massive tactical advantage. I needed her official testimony to freeze their assets before they ever landed in Zurich, effectively trapping them inside their own trap. I turned to Victor Rossi, my voice echoing in the cold silence of the executive office. I told him we needed to find the senior flight attendant immediately. Her name was Sarah. She was the only independent witness to the chemical paralysis and my son's aggressive interference on the aircraft. Victor did not waste a single breath asking unnecessary questions. He simply pivoted back to his glowing computer monitors and rapidly accessed the highly secure employee scheduling databases for the international airline. His fingers flew across the keyboard with absolute precision, slicing through their corporate firewalls in a matter of seconds. He quickly located the current flight manifests and crew duty logs. A sharp, triumphant smile crossed his hardened face. He informed me that Sarah had not actually departed on the 12-hour flight to Switzerland. Her scheduled shift had officially ended the moment the aircraft doors were sealed. She had simply handed over the primary cabin responsibilities to the relief crew and stepped off the plane. According to the airline database, she was currently on a mandatory 24-hour layover right here in the city. Victor traced her airline voucher directly to a high-end corporate hotel located just 3 miles from the airport terminal. We packed the decrypted hard drives and rushed back to his black sedan. The rain was pouring down in heavy sheets as we sped through the dark, empty streets of downtown Seattle. The luxury hotel lobby was mostly deserted at this hour of the early morning. A few weary travelers were sleeping on the leather sofas, but the grand marble foyer was otherwise completely silent. Victor bypassed the main reception desk entirely. He used his extensive network of local security contacts to acquire Sarah's exact room number without leaving a digital trace. We rode the glass elevator to the 7th floor, the soft ambient music playing in the background, providing a stark contrast to the violent turmoil churning inside my chest. I had to convince a complete stranger to risk her professional career and her personal safety to testify against two incredibly dangerous, wealthy criminals. We stopped in front of room 712. I took a deep breath to steady my racing heart, smoothing the front of my wrinkled suit jacket, and knocked firmly on the heavy wooden door. For a long moment, there was absolutely no response. I knocked again, slightly louder this time. I heard the soft rustle of movement from inside the room, followed by the metallic click of the security peephole sliding open. A heavy silence stretched between us through the thick wooden barrier. Then the heavy deadbolt slowly turned. The door opened just a few inches, held securely in place by a thick brass chain. Sarah stood in the narrow gap, still wearing her crisp airline uniform. Her eyes widened in absolute shock the moment she recognized my face. She looked at me, then glanced nervously at Victor, standing silently in the shadows behind me. She was clearly terrified, clutching the edge of the door with trembling hands. I kept my voice incredibly low and calm, assuring her that we meant her no harm. I told her I was the man from the premium cabin, the man she had tried to save with the oxygen mask. I thanked her for her bravery and gently explained that I desperately needed her help to stop a massive premeditated crime. Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second, her professional training battling against her basic human intuition. She looked deeply into my tired, aging eyes and saw the raw, unfiltered truth of my desperation. She slowly unlatched the brass chain and opened the door wide, silently inviting us into the small suite. She directed us to a small sitting area near the window and offered us bottled water from the small refrigerator. I declined the water, getting straight to the point. I asked her why she had looked at me with such profound, desperate anxiety on the airplane. I asked her how she knew my son was lying about my medical history. Sarah took a deep, shaky breath, nervously twisting a small silver ring on her finger. She looked down at the carpet, her voice trembling slightly as she began to speak. She revealed that this flight to Zurich was not her first encounter with my treacherous family. Exactly 3 weeks ago, she had worked a routine domestic flight from Los Angeles back to Seattle. Derek and Victoria had been passengers in her first-class section. She explained that they had been drinking heavily throughout the short flight, completely dropping their guarded public personas. They had assumed the flight crew was ignoring them, blending into the background of the noisy cabin. But Sarah was a highly trained, deeply observant professional. She noticed everything. She noticed the incredibly inappropriate, intimate physical contact between a man and his supposed stepmother. She noticed the dark, aggressive energy radiating from my son. And most importantly, she overheard their hushed, venomous arguments in the narrow galley near the lavatories. She told me Victoria had cornered Derek near the emergency exit, her voice slurring with expensive champagne and intense paranoia. Victoria was complaining loudly about the extreme difficulty of maintaining her role as the devoted, loving wife. She was terrified I would discover the affair before they could execute the final stage of their complex plan. Sarah paused, her eyes welling up with unshed tears. She looked directly at me, her expression filled with profound sympathy. She said she had pretended to arrange the catering carts, keeping her back turned to them, while she listened to every single word. She realized very quickly that they were not just discussing an illicit affair. They were actively plotting a murder. Sarah reached into the pocket of her uniform jacket and slowly pulled out her personal mobile phone. She explained that the sheer evil of their conversation had terrified her so deeply that she had quietly pressed the record button, capturing the entire horrific exchange. She unlocked her device and placed it carefully on the small coffee table between us. She pressed play. The audio quality was slightly muffled by the ambient hum of the jet engines, but the cruel, distinct voices of my family were absolutely unmistakable. I heard Victoria crying softly, complaining about the crushing weight of her daily performance. Then I heard Derek's voice, cold, metallic, and devoid of any human empathy, He spoke with the chilling authority of a seasoned sociopath. His words pierced through the quiet hotel room like a barrage of physical blows. "You just need to hold it together for 3 more weeks," Victoria Derrick's recorded voice sneered with absolute contempt. "Once we get the old fool to Zurich, the drugs will keep him docile enough for the intake doctors. The $20 million is ours, and he rots in the Alps. We will be billionaires by morning, and nobody will ever ask a single question." The audio recording ended with a sharp click, leaving a suffocating, heavy silence in the hotel room. I stared at the dark screen of the mobile phone, my entire body rigid with a freezing, calculated fury. The final piece of the devastating puzzle had just violently snapped into place. This was not just circumstantial digital evidence hidden on a corporate server. This was an undeniable, explicit verbal confession. It was the absolute smoking gun I desperately needed to destroy them. I looked at Victor Rossi. The private investigator was already pulling a secure, encrypted storage drive from his heavy equipment bag. He connected a small cable to Sarah's phone and swiftly transferred the audio file, permanently preserving the damning evidence. I thanked Sarah for her incredible courage. I assured her that my powerful legal team would protect her identity and her career from any potential corporate backlash. We left the hotel room and walked quickly back to the underground parking garage. The pieces were finally fully assembled in my hands. The entire tactical landscape had shifted entirely in my favor. I had the official forged medical records detailing the fake terminal dementia. I had the deeply disturbing high-resolution photographs proving the sickening, incestuous 4-year affair. I had the pending toxicological blood test results that would undeniably prove the presence of unauthorized heavy neurological sedatives in my system. And now I possessed the crystal-clear, irrefutable audio recording of their explicit conspiracy to commit kidnapping, massive wire fraud, and attempted murder. I had a completely airtight, federal criminal case ready to be delivered directly to the highest levels of international law enforcement. I slid into the passenger seat of Victor's sedan, pulling my phone from my pocket. I immediately dialed Benjamin Carter, my lead corporate attorney. I ordered him to contact the federal authorities without a single second of delay. I looked at my watch. The massive commercial flight lands in Zurich in exactly 45 minutes. I was entirely ready for them. Now, 12 hours of anticipation had finally come to an end. The massive airliner touched down smoothly on the pristine tarmac of the Zurich airport, the heavy thrust reversers roaring loudly as the aircraft slowed against the stunning backdrop of the snow-capped Swiss Alps. Inside the premium cabin, Derek and Victoria sat side by side, radiating a quiet sense of absolute triumph. They had survived the agonizing flight without a wireless connection. They spent the entire journey whispering in the darkened cabin, meticulously planning their new life of tropical wealth. They were convinced their flawless extraction was a resounding success. They believed I was locked away in a Seattle hospital, heavily sedated, while my corporate fortune rested safely offshore. As the aircraft taxied toward the terminal, the chime of the seatbelt sign filled the cabin. Derek was the first passenger to unbuckle. He stood up with arrogant ease, retrieving his leather briefcase from the overhead bin. He looked down at Victoria, offering a sickeningly handsome smile. The grueling wait was over. It was time to collect their reward. They joined the queue of passengers waiting for the steel doors to open. The moment the rubber seals hissed and the doors swung outward, a rush of mountain air flooded the cabin. Derek stepped onto the carpeted incline of the jet bridge, Victoria following closely. They pulled their mobile devices from their pockets. The screens illuminated their faces as they disabled airplane mode, desperate to establish a cellular connection. They were not checking for messages from family. They were furiously logging into their encrypted financial portals, hungry to see the confirmation of the $20 million wire transfer. They expected to see a screen filled with zeros, the ultimate validation of their horrific betrayal. They were so absorbed by the glowing screens that they did not even look up until they were halfway down the enclosed corridor. They did not notice the absolute silence. They did not notice that the standard gate agents were absent. Derek finally tore his eyes away from the loading icon on his application. He froze instantly, his polished leather shoes skidding to an abrupt halt on the blue carpet. Victoria slammed into his back, letting out a sharp gasp before peering around his shoulder. The exit of the jet bridge was barricaded by a formidable wall of dark tactical uniforms. 12 heavily armed officers from the Swiss Federal Police stood in a precise semicircle, their hands resting cautiously near their secured firearms. Standing directly in the center of the tactical unit were two stern individuals wearing the sharp suits of Interpol agents. Swiss banking authorities are renowned for their uncompromising severity when dealing with massive wire fraud, and the intimidating response team clearly reflected the monumental scale of the crime. Derek lowered his mobile phone, his arrogant smile vanishing instantly, replaced by a mask of pale, unadulterated terror. He tried to take a step backward, his survival instincts screaming at him to retreat to the aircraft, but two armed Swiss officers had already moved swiftly down the narrow corridor, firmly blocking their only avenue of escape. They were completely surrounded in the windowless tunnel. A tall Interpol agent stepped forward, his face carved from cold stone. He did not ask for their passports. He simply extended his arm, holding up a large digital tablet. The screen of the tablet streamed a live video feed directly from Seattle. I was sitting comfortably at the head of my mahogany conference table in the corporate boardroom, flanked by Victor Rossi and my lead attorney. I was dressed in a tailored navy suit, looking directly into the camera lens with absolute clarity. The chemical fog had dissipated, leaving only the calculating focus of a man who had reclaimed his empire. Derek stared at the live video feed, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream. His mind could not process the impossible image. He was staring at a ghost. He was staring at the man he confidently assumed was dying of a manufactured cognitive collapse thousands of miles away. "Welcome to Zurich," I said. My voice was perfectly smooth, echoing loudly from the speakers of the tablet and filling the tense silence of the jet bridge. It carried the heavy, unmistakable weight of absolute authority. "I trust you found the premium cabin accommodations comfortable for your final journey as a free man." Victoria let out a whimpering sound, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. Her manicured fingers dug painfully into her pale cheeks. She stumbled backward, leaning heavily against the metal wall of the tunnel as her legs lost all their strength. "You look surprised, Derek." I continued, leaning forward slightly in my leather boardroom chair. "You should not be. You assumed you were dealing with a clueless, failing old man. You built an elaborate plan to steal my fortune and lock me away in a mountain cage. But you made one catastrophic miscalculation. You forgot that I spent 40 years ruthlessly building a corporate empire. I do not simply surrender. I destroy anyone who threatens my family." Derek finally found his voice, a pathetic squeak of desperate denial. "This is a misunderstanding," he stammered, looking wildly around. "Father, I was trying to help you. Your mind is failing. We were bringing you to a specialized clinic. I have the documents right here to prove it." I raised my hand, silencing his pathetic lies with a simple gesture. "Do not insult my intelligence any further, Derek. We drilled the locks on your executive office 5 hours ago. We found the forged medical dossier. We found the encrypted routing numbers for your offshore trust accounts. And most importantly, we found the hidden folder labeled A and D. We found the intimate photographs. We read every single text message detailing your 4-year affair with my wife. We know exactly how long you have been planning to murder me." Derek flinched violently, as if he had been physically struck by a blunt object. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified animal. He looked desperately down at his phone, frantically swiping the screen. "Are you looking for the $20 million?" I asked, allowing a thin, cold smile to cross my face. I held up a thick stack of official banking documents to the camera lens. "You will not find it. Swiss banking regulators do not take kindly to wire fraud. When my legal team provided them with the audio recording of your plot, they cooperated immediately. Your offshore accounts are permanently frozen. The money has been reversed and secured back into my primary holding accounts. You possess nothing." Derek dropped his phone. He realized his master plan had collapsed. He was standing on foreign soil penniless, surrounded by armed federal agents holding undeniable proof of his crimes. But I was not finished. I had to dismantle the last pillar of his fraudulent life. "There is one more thing you should know before the officers process your arrest," I stated. "Megan sends her regards." Derek snapped his head up, his eyes wide with acute panic. "Yes," I continued. "My investigator sent the digital gallery of your disgusting affair directly to your wife's personal email. She has packed her bags, vacated your house, and filed for an immediate divorce. She is taking your domestic accounts and your public reputation. Your name will be completely worthless." The total, absolutely all-encompassing devastation of his reality finally crushed Derek. He had just lost his fortune, his absolute freedom, his marriage, and his entire family legacy in a single perfectly executed counterattack. He stood completely frozen, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. Victoria, however, possessed an entirely different survival instinct. The exact moment she realized the stolen money was gone, and their affair was exposed, her self-preserving nature brutally took over. Realizing she was standing next to a rapidly sinking ship, she desperately wanted to throw him overboard to save herself. She lunged forward, her face twisted in an ugly mask of terror. Pointing a trembling finger directly at Derek, she screamed at the surrounding Interpol agents. "It was him. It was all his idea," she shrieked. "He forced me to do it. He threatened me. I was just a victim. He is an absolute monster." The ultimate betrayal from his partner was the absolute final breaking point for Derek. The last shred of his carefully practiced corporate sanity violently snapped under the sudden crushing weight of her immediate defection. His eyes rolled back with terrifying madness as he stared at the woman he risked everything to claim. He let out a primal, echoing roar of pure, unfiltered fury. He dropped his expensive leather briefcase to the ground, completely forgetting the 12 heavily armed federal police officers actively surrounding him, with their hand resting securely on their weapons. He lunged wildly across the narrow enclosed space of the jet bridge, violently tackling a wildly screaming Victoria, directly to the carpeted floor. The violent impact of their bodies hitting the jet bridge floor sent a shockwave through the video feed. The chaotic thud was instantly followed by the commanding shouts of the Swiss Federal Police. 12 armed officers swarmed the struggling pair in mere seconds. I watched through the screen as heavy boots pinned my son to the carpet, his arms forcefully wrenched behind his back. Victoria was sobbing hysterically, her clothing torn and disheveled as an officer hauled her to her feet and clamped steel handcuffs around her wrists. The sheer indignity of their capture was absolute. They had flown halfway across the world to claim a stolen fortune only to be tackled and restrained like street thugs in a foreign terminal. I watched the Interpol agent step back into the frame, nodding silently, before he reached down and severed the connection. The screen went black. The war was officially over. The aftermath moved with the swift, merciless efficiency of a corporate liquidation. Within the first 48 hours, Benjamin and Victor coordinated directly with international banking authorities. Because we intercepted the wire transfer before it dispersed into untraceable shell companies, the fraud alert triggered a hard freeze on their shadow accounts. The stolen $20 million was meticulously clawed back dollar by dollar and deposited into my primary holding accounts. Derek and Victoria never saw a single cent. Instead, they were formally booked into a high-security Swiss federal prison locked in separate windowless holding cells. They are awaiting formal extradition back to the United States, where federal prosecutors have prepared a massive, airtight indictment. They are facing a minimum of 25 years each for international wire fraud conspiracy to commit kidnapping and attempted murder. I was informed that they have already turned on each other, desperately offering to testify against one another for leniency. There will be absolutely no leniency. My first official act as a reinstated corporate patriarch was to call Benjamin into my office. I instructed him to draft a comprehensive, legally impenetrable revision of my entire estate. I systematically and permanently disinherited Derek. I legally stripped him of his title, his shares, and his surname. I ensured he would not receive a single dime from my life's work, neither now nor upon my eventual death. He was entirely erased from my legacy, reduced to a pathetic cautionary tale in the footnotes of my company history. But there was one final vital debt left to settle. I arranged a private meeting with Sarah, the senior flight attendant, who refused to look the other way. We met in a quiet, sunlit corner of a small coffee shop in downtown Seattle. She arrived looking slightly nervous, wearing casual clothes instead of her crisp airline uniform. I stood up and offered her my hand, not as a helpless passenger, but as a man who owed her his existence. We sat down, and I pushed a thick, sealed envelope across the wooden table. I told her that through Victor's background check, I had learned a great deal about her. I knew she had spent 15 years working exhausting international flights, saving every spare dollar, with the quiet hope of one day opening her own artisan bakery. Sarah looked at the envelope, her hands trembling slightly as she opened the flap. Inside was a certified cashier's check drawing directly from my personal accounts. It was a massive, life-changing financial reward. It was more than enough to completely fund her bakery purchase, the commercial property outright, and guarantee her personal financial security for the rest of her life. She stared at the numbers, her eyes welling up with genuine tears. She tried to refuse, stammering that she was only doing her job, that it was far too much money. I placed my hand gently over hers. I told her that courage has a price, and true integrity is the rarest commodity in the world. She risked her entire career and personal safety to save a stranger. She had earned every single penny. I told her to quit her job, sign the lease on her dream storefront, and never look back. I left her sitting in the quiet cafe, weeping tears of absolute joy, holding the physical manifestation of her future in her hands. I am 70 years old today. I am standing alone in the sprawling glass-walled corner office of my corporate skyscraper, looking out over the rain-swept skyline of Seattle. The massive city stretches out far beneath me, a vast network of cold steel concrete and endless ambition shimmering under the fading light of the sun. The towering structures I helped build stand as silent monuments to a lifetime of relentless labor. For 40 years, I believed that my legacy was tied exclusively to my bloodline. I believed that family was an unbreakable bond, a sacred foundation that could weather any storm. I was incredibly dangerously wrong. The hardest lesson a man can ever learn is that toxic bloodlines must be ruthlessly severed in order to survive. We are socially conditioned to forgive our children, to make endless excuses for their greed, and to blindly trust the people who share our homes and our names. We foolishly choose to ignore the subtle warning signs. We blindly dismiss the cold glances, the whispered conversations, and the creeping sense of unease that settles in our stomachs when their smiles do not reach their eyes. We desperately want to believe the beautiful lie because the ugly truth is simply too devastating to accept. But survival demands absolute, unflinching honesty. If you sense a shift in the current, if your gut instinct screams that the people closest to you are plotting your demise, you must listen. You must stop making excuses for their cruelty. You must secretly gather your evidence, fortify your defenses, and strike back with overwhelming, calculated precision. I look down at my hands. They are older now, lined with deep veins and age spots, but they are absolutely no longer trembling. The heavy chemical fog has completely lifted from my mind. The oppressive weight of a fake marriage and a treacherous son has been entirely removed from my shoulders. I lost a deeply significant portion of the family. I thought I once had, but in exchange I reclaimed my life, my fortune, and my unyielding dignity. My empire is secure, managed by a new board of directors who respect my authority rather than covet my early grave. I am navigating the twilight of my life without a wife to comfort me, and without a son to inherit my throne. Many men might view this immense solitude as a tragic defeat, a sad, lonely conclusion to a life spent accumulating wealth. But as I watch the dark clouds break over the Pacific Ocean, allowing a brilliant shaft of golden sunlight to pierce through the gray Seattle sky, I do not feel defeated. I feel an overwhelming, profound sense of absolute peace. I am standing at the very top of the world I built with my own 2 hands. I am truly alive. I am fully in control. And for the very first time in 4 years, I am completely, unapologetically free.